Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here again with a fourth chapter from this book collecting game by A. Edward Newton. This of course is the fourth video I've made in the Reading Aloud series that I've been doing in collaboration with Sean D. Standfast. Sean is reading the amenities of book collecting on the days that I am not reading from this book collecting game. Both these books are essay collections from A. Edward Newton. And today I'm on to chapter 4, titled When We Were Very Young. The considerate reader, and I hope I shall have no other, will observe in the course of this paper that it does not date, nor does it place. I have taken my title, When We Were Very Young, from a book of charming verse. I might have taken it from another book and called it Far Away and Long Ago, for the world spins round with what seems to be an ever-increasing acceleration, and we seem to be almost as far away from the Battle of Bunker Hill as we are from the Battle of Hastings. And with this introduction, I shall ask you to go back with me as patiently as you can, for 20 minutes or so, to old New York when it was really new, and to Philadelphia, that clever town built by the Quakers, and to Boston, that early took to fishing for a living, and to hearing sermons for recreation. We shall go back to these towns when they were very young, when they were spread out pretty thin along the Atlantic coast, with great gaps of wilderness in between, a time when we had just about decided that we would be English and nothing else, which is only another way of saying that the French and the Swedes and the Dutch had lost out in the race of colonization. I am very glad to hear of that, for I would not wish to speak any language other than English, which comes to me so naturally. We were pious, God-fearing people in those days. We all believed in a personal God of whose appearance we knew nothing, and a personal devil of whose appearance we knew much, he having been many times painted and described as having horns, hoofs, and tail. And to keep us in a frenzy of fear, we employed preachers. They were as plentiful as blackberries in those days, who told us what we should and what we should not do, and especially where we should go if we did not do as they told us. But if our ancestors were religious, they were also adventurous. They had not left England for that country's good, as has been wittily said of the early settlers of Australia, but to subdue a continent in which they might worship God in their own way, with a Bible in one hand and an axe in another and a gun in another. And having suffered much for conscience' sake at home, they sought a free country, and immediately proceeded to make it less free than the one they left behind. This is quite inexplicable, but then most things are. Speaking roughly, very roughly, 3 groups settled this country: the Puritans, the north; the Quakers, the middle; and the Cavaliers, the south. And the Puritans had no sooner settled in New France and renamed it New England than religious controversy and persecution became a matter of continuing occurrence, if the phrase may be permitted. They were as harsh and as hard as their climate or the rocky coast on which dashed the waves of the ocean. This quality of harshness was reflected naturally in their literature. If any were merry, they were exhorted to sing psalms, and the first book they printed was a metrical paraphrase of the Psalms. They might have done worse, indeed they soon did. Cotton Mather, one of the long line of eminent divines, soon published a book on the nature, number, and operations of the devil, and another in which he sought to prove that children who were unable to recite his friend John Cotton's catechism without falling into spasm were certainly possessed of the devil. The full title of his friend's catechism is Spiritual Milk for Boston Babes in Either England, drawn out of the breasts of both Testament for their souls' nourishment. It is an excessively rare book. But we must approach this subject of printing in an orderly manner, or we shall get nowhere. And incidentally, let me say that the first printing press was set up in the New World was not as we might expect in Boston or Philadelphia, but in Mexico City, or rather the city of Mexico. The first job of printing done in what we now call the United States was a small broadside known as the Oath of a Freeman. It was printed in 1638 and is a noble document. It ends with these words, which are calculated to make a politician laugh: I do solemnly bind myself to give my vote, as I shall judge in mine own conscience may best conduce to the public weal, without respect of persons or favor of any man, so help me God. No copy of the first printing is known to exist. An almanac for the year 1639 followed, and one for 1640 followed that, and then in the same year the Bay Psalm book already referred to. The publication of Bibles in English was a crown monopoly, that is to say, Robert Barker and his successors in London alone could print Bibles in English. But there was nothing to prevent a sort of sing-song version of the Psalms being made and printed that accounts for the existence of the Bay Psalm book. Stephen Day it was who first set up and printed in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the Freeman's Oath, the Almanacs, and then the Psalm book. And in the same place and about the same time, there were educational beginnings to which subsequently was attached the name of John Harvard. That the Gutenberg Bible is to Europe. What the Gutenberg Bible is to Europe, the Bay Psalm book is to the United States. The edition is estimated at 1,600 copies, out of which only 11 have survived, and of these, 6 are imperfect. The American Antiquarian Society at Worcester, Massachusetts, there is a copy of this famous book in which is a note of Isaiah Thomas, the founder, reading. After advertising for another copy of this book and making inquiry in many places in New England, I was not able to obtain or even hear of another copy. This copy is therefore invaluable and must be preserved with the greatest care. It is in its original binding. The Psalm book was followed by more almanacs and codes of law, catechisms, spelling books, and sermons. The Milk for Babes appeared in 1656 and was printed in Boston at the press of Samuel Green. And 3 years later, the same printer started something by printing a tract with some such title as The Heart of New England Rent at the blasphemies of the present generation, with special reference to the destructive nature of the religion of the sect called Quakers. With this document began a long and virulent controversy. Preachers hurled sermons at one another, as Irishmen do brickbats, and not content with so doing, they had them printed that a wider audience could be reached. It seems curious that the most bitter discussions and the most terrible suffering that man has afflicted upon his fellow man have had invariably as their basis some question concerning what is usually called religion. You would not bear with me were I to write a paper on the religious and controversial literature of New England, but place must be found for brief reference to one little volume of poems entitled The Day of Doom. This book of religious poetry was first published at Boston about 1664. It has been called, and very properly, a blazing and sulphurous volume, but it molded the thought of New England more positively and effectively than any other book of its time. It attributed to the divine being a character more loathsome than any to be met with in any literature, either Christian or pagan. Yet it had for 100 years a popularity far exceeding any other work in prose or in verse produced in America before the Revolution. On a recent visit to New England, I meant to run down, if it were possible, an early edition of this work in one of the libraries, but I forgot to do so. My copy is the 7th edition, published in 1751. What has become of all the 1st, or the 3rd, or the 5th? Where are they all? Literally read to pieces, so popular were they. This famous little book, written by Michael Wigglesworth, pastor at Malden and professor of divinity at Harvard, purports to tell how the day of doom came with a crash as of thunder and a flash as of lightning to the horror and consternation of the world. It was Judgment Day, and immediately the good and the evil separated themselves before the judgment seat, as though they had rehearsed the act. The goats on one side and the sheep on the other, murderers, thieves, enchanters, witches, idolaters, whoremongers, those who get rich too fast, haunters of alehouses, blasphemers, lewd, swearers, shrewd to the left. On the other hand, the sheep do stand. The proceedings are ghastly. Weepings and wailings and gnashing of teeth are heard, as the goats are hurried into everlasting fire. Finally, a band of little children draw near, those who never had a chance to do evil, but were straightway carried from the womb to the tomb. What is to be their fate? The judge is moved to compassion, at least that is what it is called in the poem, and thus addresses the children. I do confess your crime is less, though every sin's a crime, but a crime it is, therefore in bliss you may not hope to dwell. But unto you I shall allow the easiest room in hell. Think of it, but listen, the sheep are singing, They rejoice to see all those that were their foes thus sent to punishment. Then do they sing unto their king a song of endless praise. They praise his name and do proclaim that just are all his ways. I have not, I think, painted in too lurid colors the literature of New England, and it will at once be seen that work of this gruesome character will not stand comparison with that which was being produced in England at the time. The lyrics of Herrick or the work of Mr. Lumo Gulliver, for example. But human nature is human nature. Not every day is Judgment Day, thank God, nor is it a New England Sunday. May we not suppose that occasionally, on a weekday perchance, a longing might be expressed for some reading in a lighter vein than the poems of Michael Wigglesworth or the sermons of Cotton Mather? Yes, there was such a longing, but before relating how it was satisfied, let me say a word about the first Bible printed in this country. Thomas Aitken, a Scotch printer settled in Philadelphia, printed the first Bible in English after the Revolutionary War, by which we had freed ourselves from countless annoying little restrictions upon our trades and commerce, amongst which the printing of Bibles was the least. Few except students have read a little book published in London in 1765 entitled An Act for Granting and Applying Certain Stamp Duties and Other Duties in the British Colonies and Plantations in America. It is commonly called the Stamp Act, and in a volume of 60 or more pages recites how upon every skin or piece of vellum or sheet or piece of paper on which shall be engrossed or written or printed any grant deed or other instrument whatsoever, there shall be a stamp of 2 shillings or a greater sum, and on a pack of cards the sum of 1 shilling, and for every pair of dice 10 shillings. And when all these duties were found to be unworkable and were repealed, it was followed by what the historians call the 5 intolerable acts, including one to regulate and suppress commerce. But there was no law against printing Bibles in a foreign language, and if the translation of the Scriptures by John Eliot be not in a foreign language, then I am unable to tell a foreign language when I see one. I shall not attempt to enlarge upon the title of John Eliot's Indian Bible, as it is usually called, not only because I cannot, but because I fear very few of my readers understand the dialect of the Indians spoken in Massachusetts in the year 1663. I admit that the book is not handsome, but it was a noble venture on the part of Eliot and also of the printer. Of course, the consent of the Crown had first to be secured, but there was no difficulty about this, and finally appeared from the press of Samuel Green and Marmaduke Johnson, the famous book with an unpronounceable name, a small quarto of 600 unnumbered pages. It was printed on good paper, from new typeset in double columns, and by general consent, the finest known copy is in the Morgan Library. We should have been disappointed not to have found it there. There are, however, a good many other copies existing. It was not thumbed out of existence as so many early Bibles were. I suspect that the Sitting Bulls and the Reigns in the Face of the time cared little for it, and I doubt whether the fine copy that was sent to King Charles II, then reigning in England, withdrew his attention for long from the frail beauties of his court, although he had expressed a desire to see the famous book, and one of the earliest copies was presented to him by the governor of Massachusetts for the time being. Other Bibles and fragments of Bibles in the language of the Indians of Massachusetts were printed by Eliot from time to time, but the great item of this character remains to be mentioned, Richard Baxter's Call to the Unconverted, of which Evans' Bibliography of Early American Imprint says no copy of the 1664 edition is known to exist. But to the delight of Dr. Rosenbach, a copy was discovered not long ago in the library of the Royal Society in London and sent to the auction room, where it was, of course, purchased by him for the sum of £6,800, about $34,000, he acting for Mr. Huddington. This was the last important work to which the pious John Eliot's name is attached. Of course, the discovery of the unique book, its sale, and the high price it fetched, made an interesting news story, and was told in various ways in the newspapers all over the world, with this result, among many others. One day there walked into the Rosenbach's establishment in Philadelphia from New England an old clergyman who had read of the transaction and was thrilled by what he thought was the discovery of another copy of the identical book in his own house. For every great book unexpectedly bringing fame and wealth to its owner, there are 10,000 disappointments. The copy which the old gentleman had brought to Philadelphia was an English reprint published a few years ago in Hartford, and was not worth the paper and twine in which it was wrapped. For a few days, a few weeks perhaps, its owner had deluded himself with the idea that he had a book worth $34,000, and he almost fainted when he was told that his book was quite worthless. No bookseller has ever occupied the position which is now admittedly Dr. Rosenbach's. He is the first bookseller in the world today. I could, I am quite sure, prove this statement, but in the words of Dr. Johnson, I shall expect it to be accepted without proof. And now let me tell you another story of this remarkable man. Some time ago he, being in London, discovered in the auction room another famous book, a copy of Philip Payne's Daily Meditations, printed in Cambridge in 1668. It was the first volume of poems, so called, published in this country. Dr. Rosenbach said nothing, listened, but heard nothing. None of the booksellers in London said a word about the book, and it seemed evident that they thought the imprint, Marmaduke Johnson, Cambridge, 1668, meant Cambridge, England. Was it possible they were all napping? And here we have a photograph of Dr. Rosenbach leaving London, loaded down with priceless books. Was it possible they were all napping? Seymour de Ricci, the great French bibliographer, was in London and said Rosie took into confidence. Said he to de Ricci, "This Daily Meditations is the first volume of poems published in America. It is unique and worth anywhere from £5,000 to £10,000. I shall buy it from Mr. Huntington, but if I bid on the book myself, it may be that the talent will smell a rat. For everyone knows, or ought to know, that Marmaduke Johnson was a great colonial printer. Now what I want you to do is this. When the book comes out at the sale, I shall glance at it and yawn and pass it on. I shall not bid. Let someone else start the bidding. And when I hold my pencil like this, suiting the action of the word, you commence bidding and keep on." What happened? Well, the bidding began at £5, and in about a minute de Ricci had the book for £51, and there was great jargon when it was discovered that Rosie had again put one over the most astute group of book buyers in the world. And Mr. Huntington enriched his library with a unique item for £51, plus the usual 10%. It was 1678, 10 years before another volume of poetry was published in the colonies, when Anne Dudley Bradstreet published a reprint of a book which first saw the light in London in 1650, its English title being The 10th Muse, lately sprung up in America. But its title in the colonial edition was Several Poems, compiled with great variety of wit and learning by a gentlewoman in New England. A copy of this from Dr. Rosenbach's personal library is before me as I write. I shall not detain you with what the poet who called himself the simple cobbler of Agawam, now Ipswich, where the hooked rug comes from, but pass on to what may with justice be called the first printing of an English classic in America. Having in mind the temper, or rather the temperament, of the colonists, it is not hard to guess that the book was Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. A copy of this famous book had found its way to Boston. An enterprising printer had put it in type, and it was being circulated in New England as early as 1681. Would you like to see a copy of this rare book? Only one is known to exist. It was formerly George Brinley's. It is now in the Huntington Library near Los Angeles. 3 books there are, the popularity of which makes them practically unattainable today in first editions. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is one, the New England Primer, with its rhymed alphabet beginning, "In Adam's fall we sinned all," down to "Zacchaeus, he did climb a tree, his Lord to see," is another, and the third is the Divine Songs of Isaac Watts. Of this last, my friend Wilbur Macy Stone says there were no less than 250 editions, mind you, published in Great Britain, and over 300 editions in America. Rhyme embalms reason, for nothing else does, and the proof, if proof were necessary, of the immense vitality of Bunyan is that he wrote in prose. Before me is a copy of the Pilgrim's Progress, the second part, published in Boston, New England, by John Draper of Charles Harrison, over against the brazen head of Cornhill in 1744. It is the first edition of the second part published in America, and is the property of Professor Tinker of Yale. What does Tinker mean? He is a churchman with this dissenter in his library, this wolf in his fold. I think I shall not return it to him. Speaking of classics, it is usually said that the first classic published in America is Cicero's Cato Major, published by Franklin in Philadelphia in 1744. Franklin himself is our authority for the statement that it is the first translation of a classic in this Western world, and adds the hope that it may be followed by others performed with equal judgment and success, and be a happy omen that Philadelphia shall become the seat of the American muses. This is usually understood as meaning edition of a classic, but Franklin, of course, knew that already S. Kamer, his first employer in 2nd Street, Philadelphia, had as early as 1729 published Epictetus, his Morals, a seemingly unique copy at the Brinley sale brought $7. Now that these vanities are better appreciated, $7,000 would seem to be a fair price. And now that we have come to the early Philadelphia printers, let me refer to George Wither's Abuses, Script, and Whipped. The title has always fascinated me, although I did not know until I began the study of early printing that these verses had made their appearance in Philadelphia as early as the year 1688. The title, no doubt, it was that intrigued those austere Puritans and Quakers who took their pleasures so sadly. One can, in imagination, hear some old Puritan complain that there were still abuses to be stripped and neighbors to be whipped, and that he would much like to take on the job. And here we have a title page from Cato Major, a desirable Franklin imprint. With this volume are published some of the lucubrations of Sir Francis Bacon, this first appearance in the New World. This book came from the press of William Bradford, but 2 copies are known, one of them in the safekeeping of our own Dr. Montgomery of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. I wonder whether I may not now attempt to draw some sort of mental picture of the intellectual and social life of our ancestors, whether they were Puritan or Quaker or Cavalier. The social life of the Puritans calls for little comment. It was bound up with the intellectual, and they got what kick they could, if a slang phrase be permitted, from hearing terrible tirades against all manners of things, under the guise of sermons, and appeals to the Almighty for mercy for oneself and a quick judgment upon one's neighbors, which were called prayers. And the worst of all, perhaps, was the horrible cacophony, having neither key nor direction, which was song. These were the conditions which, under that fine thing New England conscience developed. Down almost to our own time, the word theater was taboo. There came finally to be a playhouse in Boston where excellent theatrical performances were given, but the hub preferred to call it the museum. I would not be understood as slurring the New England conscience. My regret is that it no longer functions. Our Anglo-Saxon ancestors were good, substantial folk who brought to this country sound minds and strong bodies, and a fine sense of decency and order. Settling along the border of a great continent, they passed down to their children the traditions of the race from which they sprang. These traditions gave intellectual color to the hinterland of enormous extent, until finally it was washed out by an influx of foreigners who know nothing of our literature or our language and care less. We have, I am afraid, closed our doors too late. The evil of a mixed population might perhaps have been dealt with by an enlightened aristocracy, but by a democracy, never. And this is, of course, really showing the author's true colors and true opinions here. And that's actually quite shocking to read. But moving on, to get back to a pleasanter subject, some years ago there was a dinner of the New England Society in New York. The speakers lauded the New England fathers. They praised their virtue, their integrity, their skills at overcoming obstacles, their ability to withstand the rigors of the New England climate. At last, Joseph Choate, that accomplished gentleman, excellent lawyer, and exquisite wit, was asked to say something, whereupon he rose, and among other things, said that he agreed that it took a rugged character to withstand the horrors of a New England winter, that he, for his part, toasted the character of the New England mothers, for they had stood the rigors of the New England winters, and the New England fathers too. I would rather be the author of one good jest than have written a political platform. It takes more brains and it lasts longer. But I don't know. Most political platforms are very funny. I was motoring through New England, down east, last summer, and not far from Bear, in Massachusetts, past a recently completed brick building, beautifully patterned after a colonial model, obviously a public building of some sort. Inquiring of my host what it was, he told me it was a library. But who will use it? I exclaimed. There seem to be very few people hereabout. There were a few houses, to be sure, but not enough. One would suppose to call for a fine library. Oh, said my friend, we are very intellectual people up here. We have not yet been contaminated by the foreigners of Boston. Bar, which we are just approaching, has a village improvement society which is 50 years old. You'll see, and we did. One of the sweetest, most orderly hamlets in the land, I should say, with a lovely common right in the middle of it. Meantime, the man at the wheel was chanting an old saying, Bar for beauty, Petersham for pride. If it hadn't been for the codfish, Dana would have died. For salt codfish is a staple article of food during the long winter in New England. People speak of Franklin as the first civilized American. He was not. He was only one of many. There were many more civilized Americans 100 years ago, in proportion to our population, than there are today. Isaiah Thomas, of whom we in Philadelphia know little, was one of them. He, like Franklin, was a printer, a publisher, and a philanthropist, and his enduring monument is the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, to which, at his death, he bequeathed his private library, then one of the best in the country. Think of this great man, for such he was, publishing in 1787 the history of Little Goody Two-Shoes. The first English edition was published in 1766, and here we have a photograph of that first edition. The first English edition was published in 1766, and if Goody Two-Shoes is not from the pen of Oliver Goldsmith, it should have been. South of Philadelphia, the Church of England, the establishment of Charles II, and Anne and the Georges, functioned rather as a part of the social order of things than as a form of religion. Burnings for heresy and witchcraft were unknown, and as the apparel oft bespeaks the man, one's religious bias was made clear by one's costume. It was a store in New England, drab in Pennsylvania, and pleasing in the aristocratic South. And a glance at the literature of those three separate communities will show that there were two, for south of Philadelphia printing hardly existed, schools of literature. Pennsylvania was a hothouse in which every variety of religion flourished, from the Quaker of England to the Mennonite, Dunker, and Shaker of the Rhine country. Intolerance and suspicion were the bonds that united them. But these sects did not function in Philadelphia. Mercifully, they trekked westward. Philadelphia was Quaker, and Church of England aristocratic. In other words, and from these came a demand for belles lettres, and where there is a demand, a supply is not unusual. One of the great books of the world, More's Utopia, written, as the title page assures us, by Sir Thomas More, Lord Chancellor of England, was printed and sold in Philadelphia by James Chatton in Church Alley in 1753. The copy, which I have had the pleasure of examining, was purchased for the Wilmington, Delaware Library and Young Men's Association for 2 shillings and 6pence, an excellent investment of half a crown. Pope's essay on man was printed and sold by W. Dunlap at the newest printing office in Market Street in 1762. It would be interesting to know which appeared first, Goldsmith's Traveller from the press of Aitken or Johnston's Rassalis, published by Robert Bell. They both appeared in the same year, 1768. The authors were friends and in some sort rivals, and we may, if we will, fancy a pleasant contest of wits between the two men upon hearing of the literary activities of the Plantonians. Professor Tinker calls attention to the fact that Bell, the publisher of Rassalis, so calls the story for the first time on any title page, and Rassalis it has since remained. Bell used the imprint America instead of the usual one, Philadelphia, and he also employed the phrase printed for every purchaser, which pleased Dr. Johnson because it suggested to him that the printer expected that the book would be scattered among the people. Tinker adds in his pretty little history of this volume that when William White, who subsequently became the first bishop of Pennsylvania, met Dr. Johnson in 1771, he told him that there was an American edition of the Rassalis and promised to send him a copy upon his return to Philadelphia, which he did, notwithstanding the fact that Johnson, complaining of the behavior of the colonists over the Stamp Act, had very rudely remarked that if he had been Prime Minister, he would have sent a man of war to level Boston or New York to the ground. But White, in telling the story, adds, "I have not heard from him sentiments which convinced me that he would not have done as he said." Johnson's bark was always worse than his bite. Aitken, who, it may be remembered, published the first English Bible in America, with the permission and endorsement of Congress in 1782, published in 1773 from his shop in Front Street, opposite the London Coffee House, Blair's Grave, to which was added an elegy written in a country churchyard by Mr. Gray. The Bible, Blair's Grave, and the country churchyard seem to suggest a gravity of mind not so conspicuous in William Menzies, who published the year before Goldsmith's Vicar of Wakefield. That lovely book was eagerly pounced upon and read to pieces. Only 3 copies of this edition are known, according to George P. Phills, the eminent authority upon Americana. All the world knows that Franklin always thought and spoke of himself as a printer, and it is not always realized how early in his career his interests were diverted into other and more important channels. His first employer in Philadelphia was Keymer, the publisher of Epictetus, but his stay with him was short, as was his stay as a journeyman printer in London. After his return to Philadelphia, he devoted his energies to his trade for a time. But before his 40th year, he had taken into partnership David Hall in order that he might retire from business, enjoy his leisure, and philosophize in his own way. At the time of his retirement, Franklin's career as one of the great men of the world had not yet begun, but his disappearance as a printer left the coast clear for Robert Bell, a Scotchman who came to this country about 1766 by way of Ireland. He first became an auctioneer and then a publisher. He first became an auctioneer and then a publisher, and an early venture was Robertson's Charles V. This was followed by Blackstone's Commentaries in 4 octavo volumes, 1772. Thomas Paine, who has never been appreciated as he deserves, for with his pen he enormously assisted the cause of the colonists, entered his employ, and Bell it was who published his famous pamphlet, Common Sense. This work had enormous sale. It appeared in 1776 at a time when there was a great scarcity of paper, and all the broken quires in Bell's warehouse were collected and culled for the first edition. Bell was a thoroughgoing Whig, zealously supporting the liberties of his country. Moreover, he was a man of taste and judgment, and honest even to his own disadvantage, as his tract on the free sale of books abundantly proves. Apparently, the General Assembly was about to take some steps looking to the limiting to one man the right to sell books by public vendue or auction. This, Bell says, would be injurious to the arts, science, learning, and manufactures of Pennsylvania, and he begs that their sale may remain free and unconfined as the circumvent air, he puts it, and especially he prays that he may not be appointed to this monopoly, notwithstanding the many claims that he might set up to a preference. And he further calls attention to the fact that the revolution was accomplished not to diminish, but to increase the freedom of every individual. The fine and unadulterated excellence of republics forbids the possibility of monopoly. How naive all this sounds today, when everything is in chains from the theater to the corner store. In 1777, Bell turned his attention to Paradise Lost. This seems to me a magnificent venture. Consider conditions in Philadelphia in 1777. They were in a commotion, to use Bell's own word. The Declaration of Independence had been signed at the State House the summer before. The Battle of Germantown had been fought and lost. Washington was at Valley Forge with his starving and naked army. Cornwallis was in control of Philadelphia, and Howe had his fleet in Delaware. Yet here was a self-contained man, doing business as usual, or trying to. But why Paradise Lost, the famous epic of which Dr. Johnson once remarked that, however magnificent it is, no man ever wished it longer? It was indicative, I think, of the good taste of our ancestors. He had no fleet. We had no fleet. Britannia ruled the waves. There was no way of getting good books, any books from London. Here, then, was an opportunity for the enterprise of Robert Bell, and he produced a very creditable piece of bookmaking. The type, ink, paper, and printing are excellent, and there is a very decent frontispiece of Milton, engraved by one J. Norman after the Faithorn portrait, with the famous lines of Dryden under it. On the whole, the volume would be no discredit to a London publisher. Yet this book was produced in Philadelphia 150 years ago, during one of the most significant wars in history. What shall I say of James Thomason's Seasons, but that no poem of equal length in England has ever been so popular? The same reason that prompted Bell to print an edition of Paradise Lost led him in that same year to print a Seasons, and once again J. Norman is called to supply a frontispiece. In this volume, the publisher tells us that his shop is in the 3rd Street next door to St. Paul's Church. We can now locate him without difficulty. The first edition of The School for Scandal, perhaps the most brilliant comedy in our language, was a pirated edition published in Dublin in 1779. 10 years later, it was printed by Pritchard and Hall in Philadelphia in Market Street, between 2nd and Front. The title page states that the play has been performed with universal applause at the theaters in New York, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. From a manuscript copy and in the possession of John Henry, a joint manager of the Old American Company. The first theatrical performance given in America was in a small loft in Philadelphia in August 1744. The play was Addison's Cato. It might be described as an amateur performance. The first American playbill known in existence announces a performance of The Orphan at the theater in Nassau Street, New York, on Monday, March 26, 1750, at precisely half an hour after 6 o'clock. The playbill also announces the sale of a parcel of ironmongery, a quantity of cordial water, and a dwelling house in Wall Street near the City Hall, inquiries for which are to be directed to Catherine Beekman, widow. That was the time to buy real estate in New York. There is also to be sold a Negro fellow who understands all sorts of country work, having been brought up to it, and a likely Negro wench. Mrs. Mary Lloyd's book, Meditations on Divine Subjects, was annotated as soon to appear, and there are current quotations on flour, beef, molasses, port wine, and rum. The price of New England rum was 2 shillings and 4 pence a gallon, whereas the best West Indian product brought as much as 3 shillings and 6 pence a gallon. But at either price, in those happy days, a man could afford to raise a thirst and a family at the same time. Today he must make his choice. He cannot do both. This, however, is a digression. The first performance of Shakespeare by a regular theatrical troupe, which came from England and performed The Merchant of Venice, took place in Williamsburg, Virginia, on September 5, 1752. From that time to the present, the theater has been the most popular of our amusements. The first Shakespeare published in the New World, Johnson's edition, by the way, was published in Philadelphia by Barron and Madden in 1795. It was in 8 volumes, the first of which has for a frontispiece a portrait of the dramatist engraved by R. Field from the Chandos picture. We must retrace our steps a little. Burns' poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect, appeared in Philadelphia, printed for and sold by Peter Stewart and George Hyde on the west side of 2nd Street, 9 doors above Chestnut, in 1788. And Byron, when his time came, was almost as popular in this country as in England. The first American edition of English Bards and Scotch Reviewers appeared in Charleston, South Carolina, in conjunction with Brannan and Morford, 118 Chestnut Street, Philadelphia. J. Maxwell, the printer, also a Philadelphian. What we should now call a blurb calls attention to the fact that many years have passed since the English press has given us a performance so replete with genius, good sense, and spirited animadversion. Byron, Scott, Tom Moore, and other popular authors were reprinted in Philadelphia almost as soon as their books came out in London. Moses Thomas being by now the leading publisher or pirate, for by now there was little credit and less risk in book printing. There were no copyright laws for many years. Our publishers battened and fattened on the English authors, much to his disgust. We took our good where we found it. So did our friends across the water, but they found little. They took what we had, a pocket handkerchief. We robbed a bank. Our morality was the same. Here and there are publications in book form, antedated the English. Charles Lamb's Mr. H, as it was performed at the Philadelphia Theatre, was printed by Mr. Carey, 122 Market Street, in 1813. The first English edition followed 5 years later. A note informs us that copyright is secured according to an act of Congress. We wonder how. A copy of this book brought $1,500 in the auction rooms of American Art Association as recently as February 1927. Lamb's Elia, the second series, appeared with the imprint of Carey Lee and Carey Philadelphia, 1825. The English edition of the same book in 1833, and the Philadelphia edition contained 6 essays not then reprinted. Thackeray's first book, The Yellow Plush Papers, was printed by Carey and Hart in Philadelphia some years before a book of his had appeared in London, and the list could be continued. By the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, Philadelphia began to lose to New York its publishing supremacy. Wilder and Campbell, in publishing in 1824 Thomas Medwin's Journals of Conversations with Byron at Pisa, announced their aim to make their establishment a focus at which most foreign publication could be found, or the channel through which they might be procured. New York, with its magnificent harbor only a few miles from the sea, gradually became an entrance to and an exit from a great continent. Publishing is not manufacturing on a great scale, as we now understand it. The thing most necessary to success is to keep in close touch with the primary makers of books, the authors. This could best be done in and from New York. This, together with the rise of the New England School, Emerson, Hawthorne, Lowell, Holmes, and the rest, who published in Boston, completed the discomfiture of our Philadelphia publishers. For a decade or two until the Civil War, our bookstores were the best in the land. Rich planters from the South invariably stopped in Philadelphia to replenish their libraries. John Pennington's shop in 7th Street near Walnut was a rendezvous for book lovers from all over the country. And Moses Pollock and Commerce Street below 5th had another well-known establishment. Pollock was the uncle of our own Dr. Rosenbach, and it is said that he once sold a book for $16 that he lived to see bring $1,600 at auction. That confirmed in him his growing belief that the best way to keep a shop was always to buy and never to sell. As he was a bachelor, he required little on which to live, and in his later years there was nothing he hated so much as a customer. When I was a boy, there was Porter and Coates, who, at 816 and subsequently at 900 Chestnut, maintained a magnificent store. There was Claxton, Remsen, and Hoffinger, and last but by no means least, there was J.B. Lippincott and Company, both of these firms having establishments on Market Street. The firm of Lippincott still maintains a fine publishing house on Washington Square, but our glory as a publishing and bookselling center has departed. One thing alone we boast, the great Curtis Company, with its famous magazines, which are the envy and the despair of the whole publishing world. And that brings us to the end of the chapter titled When We Were Very Young. And I'm realizing I forgot to say at the beginning of this video that this collection was published in 1928, and as these essays, some of them were previously published, you can pretty much bet that most of them, if not all of them, actually predate 1928. So there is some antiquated language in here, and I'm of course, reading the text with the original language of the time. So I'll be back in a day, 2 days here with chapter 5, titled The Book Itself. And be sure to hop over to Sean's channel to listen to him read from the amenities of book collecting.